Right. So I chose Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which is one of my personal favorite films, or was. And it's one of the only films that's notably set in Toronto and does star a number of Canadian actors, has some Canadian music, and was based on a comic written by Brian Lee O'Malley, who is Canadian. And it makes a point of filming at Canadian locations. In Toronto. So it's very recognizable to people who have gone to those parts of Toronto. At least it looks like Toronto, and it's not pretending to be somewhere else. And the film is described as a romantic action comedy. It's about Scott Pilgrim, who's played by Michael Cera, who's Canadian, who's a slacker musician trying to win a competition to get a record deal while also battling 7 evil exes of his newest girlfriend, who's Ramona Flowers, who's played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead. And it's kind of a difficult movie to describe what it's about, which is partly why I think it did so poorly in the box office. But it's an Edgar Wright film, and it's just a lot of fun as a movie. There's a lot of nice action sequences. It flows really well. I feel like it's a really well edited film. And then it highlights Toronto in a nice way, that in a type of Toronto culture, with like this band culture, which is kind of big in Canada, or was kind of big in Canada at that time, that not a lot of other films that I can think of have highlighted.
Yeah, I remember loving this film when it first came out back in 2010. I'd already was aware of Edgar Wright from Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, and I loved both of those movies, so I was already excited before this came out. And I loved watching it in theaters, and the thing that struck me most was how visually exciting and interesting it was, and how exciting it was to see like a video game aesthetic, or sort of video game culture and its influences represented on screen, and sort of represented as having a big part in characters' lives, because I feel like I identified with that. The way it looks, the kineticism, the kind of comic book style, the use of music, how funny it is, how quirky the characters are. It melds together so well. It is a very unique movie, and as you say, I think that's why it was a bit of a flop, because the studios didn't necessarily know how to present it or promote it to audiences. But I think it works really well. I was struck though by how I was slightly underwhelmed rewatching it a couple of weeks ago. And I still enjoyed it. It's still a fun movie, but I didn't necessarily connect with the characters as well. And I think maybe that's because when I watched it, I was in my early 20s and, trying to date and feeling that awkwardness. And I'm not really in that place in my life anymore, so I don't necessarily connect with the characters as much. And I found some of the characters a bit annoying. Like I found Ramona Flowers quite flat and uninteresting. But overall, yeah, really enjoyed the visual style and love the idea of past relationships kind of haunting you, or those personalities being in conflict with your current relationship. I think that was very, very well seated in. Like the enjoyment is purely the spectacle of what's happening and the humor, but that idea is
Yeah,
well seated
I
into
saw
the
this
action
movie for the
and
first
gives
time, I
it some
think,
depth.
when I was in high school, and I liked it, but I just like I didn't get it at all. Like I don't I was like I was like I don't understand why everyone is obsessed with this movie. But I actually really liked it the second time I watched it, which was a few weeks ago.
Mm.
Liked it a lot more. I don't know, maybe it's cuz I'm in my 20s now and I can maybe relate to it. I don't know. I don't It's not a very relatable movie to me, but like I just liked it
Mm.
a lot more. I don't know. As a teenager, I was just kind of confused. Maybe it was like I wasn't as cultured, so I was like whatever. But yeah, I definitely like agree. I mean, the Ramona Flowers is where the manic pixie dream girl like stereotype comes from, I think. And she's designed to kind of be that like girl that, everyone wants because she's so mysterious and she's just kind of like annoying, and she's like the most annoyingly type written girl character that can, exist now, that's like everywhere in like YA literature. But I found the rest of the
Mm.
movie, I mean, and she's like, I don't dislike her in the movie because like she drives the plot, but I just found the rest of the movie a lot more enjoyable. Scott Pilgrim sucks ass, but like he's supposed to. He's like kind of a bad person, and like we're not really supposed to like him, I don't think. But I think it's a good fun. It's Edgar Wright is just like he makes entertaining movies. I mean, I liked it a lot.
I think the idea that you're not supposed to or like Scott is more of a modern take on the movie. I think when it came out, that was like a likable character. And I think, and also, but this is saying something about like the 2010s or late 2000s. Ramona's like hair color is what made her interesting. And it was like, oh, that's the thing. And so that, and then she's like a complete character because she dyes her hair. Maybe we're a little more shallow back then. But that, because, you know, I watched, what was the other movie? It's with Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Zooey Deschanel, 500 Days of Summer.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. And when I watched that movie, when it came out, I was like, oh, that, like, his Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character is like kind of not a bad guy. But when you watch it in the second, like later on, you're like, oh, he's kind of, he didn't get the point of that relationship, or like he's treating her like a property. Which I think is like a change in our culture a little bit, or maybe it's just age.
Well, I think those two, Scott Pilgrim and 500 Days of Summer, are interesting because they're kind of aware of their characters' flaws. The fact that the two male leads are objectifying or projecting onto these kinds of unattainable female rewards. And, you know, this is my dream girl because such and such, she makes me feel this, rather than respecting those women as people with their own history. And that's kind of the rude awakening, I guess, that Scott Pilgrim gets, that she has dated in the past, she's got her own issues, and the journey is dealing with yourself. And I thought it was interesting the way that the film depicts video game culture as complicit in that objectification. Like the story that a lot of video games are about, like Zelda and Mario, are going to save the princess, going to get your reward. But this is a story not about getting the girl, it's about, you know, getting self-respect or fixing your own issues first. And that's kind of the victory he attains, is like self-reflection.
That's some great insight there, Duncan.
That does also definitely highlight the issues with the movie, and I think also just movies that came out around the time period, is like Ramona doesn't change as a person really, but Scott changes because of Ramona. Like, it's like the girl helps the lead change, if you know what I mean, rather than, you know, like the girl actually like getting her piece, because you know the whole thing is about how she has to, you know, has this terrible past and is trying to get away from it, and like we kind of get a resolution to that, but she really just kind of wants to run away again, and then, you know, at the end Scott like runs away with her or whatever. But like her bad things help the male lead, you know, grow, which is like, I think as a culture we've kind of moved past that kind of storytelling, but I don't know, I still liked it.
Yeah. One of the other ways we've like moved as the culture maybe is like he's dating a high schooler at the beginning of the movie, and I just like remember cringing.
Yeah, that
like,
part.
Oh,
it's like,
you're 21, 22, I think.
I've never read
she's
the
17
comics and stuff, and like, and maybe there's like more insight into everything we're talking about with the comics, but I don't know because I've never read them. But that part is so weird to me, and I'm not sure if it's supposed to be like, okay, whatever, he's dating a high schooler or not, because like all his friends are like, this is really weird, don't date a high schooler. So I don't understand, and like, you know, he never really does anything with her, and it's still like really weird and like uncomfortable, because like in his early 20s shouldn't be hanging out with a high schooler, like that's just weird. But I don't know if at the time the movie was made we were also supposed to think that, or if we were supposed to be like, yeah, this is an acceptable rebound girl. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it depicts him in a really negative light because he enjoys the fact that she's just a kid and she's like obsessed with him, and sort of he feeds off the praise and admiration she gives him. It's like an ego trip for him. And all of his friends are telling him, this is horrible, this is evil. And it's played for humor, but you get the point. Like, this is a bad thing you're doing. You should feel bad about it. And he probably does, to some extent, get that. And it seems like the decision to break up with her is because, you know, he I don't know, it's hard. It's hard to get the change. Like, he knows he can never have a serious relationship with her. And he's enjoying the power imbalance between him and this kid. it's hard to know where the movie lies because the movie seems to condemn him, but it also makes light and makes humor out of the situation. What I
I
think is interesting is that it does actually it doesn't just use knives as a prop per se. It actually does explore her character arc and the different stages of growth she goes through after being dumped by Scott. So she also kind of goes through a maturing journey to like self-realization or whatever you want to call it. And he does kind of come full circle where he realizes I shouldn't have been going out with you. I cheated on you. The way I dumped you was really horrible. I acted like an asshole. I acted really immaturely and egotistically. So I think what I appreciate about the movie is that it is showing characters who behave really badly, but doesn't necessarily like mark them as bad people. It says, you can make mistakes, but if you own up to
I
them and try and change
don't think
them,
this was from
there's
that
hope.
movie, but I could be misremembering, and might be thinking of a different TV show or something. But it's like it really depicts like what being in your 20s is like, where it's like you make mistakes, but you're still in your 20s. You have time to fix them, and that kind
Mm.
of thing, and like you're still growing as a person.
Yeah.
And it's an odd in between period where you want to be independent and you want to just do have that sense of freedom, but you also don't want to be a grown up. You don't want to have responsibilities. You still want to just hang out at the arcade. And that's Scott, I guess, regressing back into high school or regressing back into adolescence. You don't know which direction to go. And you almost have too much freedom that you end up just kind of like doing nothing, treading water. It's funny. One of the things I got from the film was like a very Gen X kind of slacker mentality. Even though these characters are all, millennials, they're similar age to me, their mentality of like too cool for school and, indifference as a form of rebellion and I don't believe in anything. That feels very much like a 90s kind of mentality.
Well, the creator is born in 79, so that's like the end of Gen X, I feel like. So he might be like projecting that onto the characters, right? So
Yeah, and like the sort of living through pop culture, like understanding the world through movies and video games and music and comic books, that feels very like Kevin Smith to me.
feels pretty modern day too, though.
That's true. I guess that mentality is here to stay. We're so saturated with pop culture.
Like
Although
franchises and
yeah. Although very little
pop culture
connection to
references.
very little
It
connection
was
to
like
like
2000.
computers and the internet and smartphones in this
Yeah, it
film.
was like
Like, I feel
2010,
like
and
that.
I don't. I think it
Maybe
takes
that's
place in
maybe it's just
2010, but like
a
obviously
bit
the
too
comics
early for
had to have
that.
come
Yeah.
out even a couple years earlier, which is still like that really fine line where like technology was like getting really popular with like everyone, and still like, oh, it was really special if you knew someone who had an iPhone or something like that in like 2008.
Hmm. Has anyone read the comics?
I did read the comics. I could not tell you much about them anymore, though.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember if
But
there was any
they were.
differences?
Some of the panels in the comics were taken like into the movie like really well. I do remember
right.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, you spoke, Scott, you spoke a little bit about its depiction of the Toronto music scene. And I think along with video games and the comic book aesthetic, that seems to be a big part of what the film is about. And the soundtrack is really good. It features a lot of original songs from, I think it's the Radiohead producers.
Yeah, like the club where they play their first band or the first Battle of the Bands. I like feel like I went to a club like that in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was trying to look up if it was filmed at the club I went to because it looked so much like clubs in Toronto at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And Battle of the Bands is like not a huge thing around here, but like I definitely went to many Battle of the Bands where it was very similar to that. Not necessarily the bass battle with like the dragons or whatever, but like what bands would play against each other and perform, and it was kind of like there's a lot of garage bands around here, and there's like a big Toronto had a lot of bands come out of it, and there's a Ontario touring scene, and it was a lot of rock music came out of Ontario because we have some Canadian content rules. where radio stations have to play a
I
certain amount
remember
of
this.
Canadian
Yes,
content.
because my friends would always be
Otherwise, we'd
talking
be
about
like
songs,
overwhelmed
and
by
they were like,
American
"Yeah, this was the
content.
most popular song
We
in whatever
suspect.
year," and I'm like, "I've never heard of this song in my entire life."
Yeah, like I talk to people about Billy Talent, and they're like really big in Toronto. They're really big in Canada, or Sloan, and Americans have no idea what I'm talking about. And it seems like the only band that they know about from Canada is like Nickelback, which is fine. they're they're very successful.
I like when Scott gets up at one of the shows and says, "We're here to make you feel sad and think about things."
Oh, well, I was gonna say, like, obviously, like, I was like, 10 when
Yeah.
this movie came out. I was like too young to like even experience any of this in the United States and stuff. But I do think there is like like even from an American perspective, like a very particular Canadian rock music scene. Cause like I loved, Simple Plan and like Mariana's Trench and like all these Canadian like emo punk rock band, like barely emo bands. And I think that this does like depict, like from my understanding, like this very particular Canadian music scene, even like that I'm like kind of familiar with too, as like someone who didn't grow up with it, but just like knew the music style. Like it's a very particular music style that like I am familiar with.
Yeah.
And apparently there were contributions from a bunch of different Canadian bands: Beck, Metric, Broken Social Scene, Cornelius, Dan the Automator, Kid Koala. I don't know any of these people. And the Radiohead producer, Nigel Godrich, all contributed. Although I think all the songs are original.
Yeah. The big song that's played at like the Clash of the Demon's Heads that's sung by Brie Larson, that's a Metric song. I think Brie Larson does a better job on it though. And it finally got released like 10 years after the movie came out.
I love that song, Black
Yeah.
Sheep.
Yeah. Metric's got a lot of big singles in Canada anyway.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys have any favorite lines?
My favorite is when the vegan police
like,
arrive.
I felt like that part was like ahead of its
that was
time.
kind of a real moment when veganism yeah. We're like, well, I think that was when like just becoming vegan was like a thing where like, oh, I'm vegan and that's my whole life. It's like I feel like CrossFit kind of replaced it where but maybe that's just my circle of friends. But yeah, that was hilarious when he's like chicken parm and clearly not vegan.
What does he say? Gelato isn't vegan. It's milk and eggs, bitch.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing that was fun to revisit was like there's so many big actors and actresses in this movie. Like and a lot of like people that became comic book superheroes after this.
Yeah, Captain America plays the second Evil X.
Yeah, Brie Larson's there. Brandon Routh played Superman before this, I think, or shortly after.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I think it was,
and like Audrey Plaza's in it, Anna Kendrick's in it. Like these are all before they became really big.
Yeah, and I think the movie took so long to make that they were doing these parts before they'd actually broken out.
Yeah.
One of the funniest characters I think is Scott's roommate. I can't remember his name. Oh, yeah. But
Wallace Wells.
Wallace, yeah. The cool gay roommate.
Wallace, yeah.
I like when he comes home and just says, "Guess who's drunk?" and he just pips his keys at Scott. And when Scott is looking for Ramona at the party, he just holds up this terribly drawn caricature and says, "Have you seen this girl?" I don't know. That always makes me laugh.
Yes, I had one thing. I forget which the main singer in the friend group. I forgot his name. So that actor is American, and I knew it because when he said Toronto, he said he was the only person in the whole movie that said Toronto. They're supposed to live in Toronto, and he didn't say it right. And that was like, I was like, I knew it. And then I went and looked it up, and I was like, he is American. I knew it.
And you are really good with language there, Abby. Almost.